Hope you're having a lovely Sunday. My name is Chris Voss. Just getting things set up here. There we go. My name is Chris Voss, and this is the Aurora Bedtime Story Project. It's raining a little bit here, so I hope you'll forgive the craziness of the hair. So tonight we're gonna have the final two stories or the final two chapters, I should say, of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. That's nice. And we're also going to have a couple more of the old Mother West Wind tales. I think the final two for a little bit because, let's make sure this is right. Okay, because thanks to an old teacher of mine, her name is Miss Cody, and she works at the Waldorf School in Lexington, and she runs, among other things, the library there. And we did a social distance handoff of books today, and so I have a big pile of books to get to in the coming weeks. Got the Cricket in Times Square here. Winnie the Pooh is up here. The Phantom Toll Booth. And an actual book of old Mother West Wind tales, which I've just been reading from printouts. So looking forward to doing that as well. Before I get to the stories, I also want to take a moment and read a little poem here. This is a poem and a little piece of art that for many years has hung at my grandmother's house, and I've always loved this. And then one day I got a gift from her, and the gift was she sent me this, and it's lovely. So now it hangs in my room, and I wanted to read the poem too because I've always loved it, and it has to do with our little friends here, the candles. The poem is called A Candle. A candle's but a simple thing. It starts with just a bit of string, but dipped and dipped with patient hand, it gathers wax upon the strand until complete and snowy white, it gives at last a lovely light. Life seems so like that bit of string, each deed we do, a simple thing. Yet, day by day, if on life's strand we work with patient heart and hand, it gathers joy, makes dark days bright, and gives at last a lovely light. Yeah, I think that's beautiful. So I wanted to read that for you. And, well, I'll just keep it here by my side. I don't think it's going to stand well over there next to the candles. I wanted to say hello to a couple of people watching along. Firstly, I want to say hello to Briggs and to his mother, Amanda, who are watching along today. Good evening, and thank you for coming along. Looking forward to the stories. I also want to say hello to my parents, to Mama and Papa, or Stefan and Jeanette, and to my sister Annika, who's watching along as well, and my other sister in Chicago, Stephanie. I haven't done a good family call out, so hello and welcome. Thanks for watching. Okay, so we got some old Mother West Wind tales here, and before we get to it, let's do our deep breath that we've been doing before every story. I love that LeVar Burton does this before his stories, and if I've borrowed it from him, I hope he doesn't mind. Okay, let's take a nice deep inhale. And exhale. That's good. That's good. So on a rainy evening here in the greater Boston area, it's time for another of Old Mother West Wind tales. Actually from a book this time. This one is called Spotty the Turtle Wins a Race. All the little people who live on the green meadows and in the smiling pool and along the laughing brook were to have a holiday. The merry little breezes of old Mother West Wind had been very busy, oh, very busy indeed, sending word to all the little meadow folk. You see, Peter Rabbit had been boasting of how fast he could run. Reddy Fox was quite sure that he could run faster than Peter Rabbit. Billy Mink, who can move so quickly you can hardly see him, was quite sure that neither Peter Rabbit nor Reddy Fox could run as fast as he. They all met one day outside the smiling pool and agreed that old Grandfather Frog would decide who was the swiftest. Old Grandfather Frog was accounted very wise. You see, he had lived a long time, oh, very much longer than any of the others, and therefore, because of the wisdom of age, Grandfather Frog was always called on to decide all disputes. He sat on his green lily pad while Billy Mink sat on the big rock and Peter Rabbit and Reddy Fox sat on the bank. Each in turn told why he thought he was fastest. Old Grandfather Frog listened and said never a word until they were all through. When they had finished, he stopped to catch a foolish green fly, and then he said, "The best way to decide who is the swiftest is to have a race." Raw. So it was agreed that Peter Rabbit and Reddy Fox and Billy Mink should start together from the old butternut tree on one edge of the meadows, race away across the green meadows to the little hill on the other side, and each bring back a nut from the old hickory which grew there. The one who first reached the old butternut tree with a hickory nut would be declared the winner. The Merry Little Breezes flew about over the green meadows telling everyone about the race, and everyone planned to be there. It was a beautiful summer day. Mr. Sun smiled and smiled, and the more he smiled, the warmer it grew. Everyone was there to see the race. Striped Chipmunk, Happy Jack Squirrel, Sammy Jay, Black Jack the Crow, Hooty the Owl, and Bobby Coon all sat up in the old butternut tree where it was cool and shady. Johnny Chuck, Jerry Muskrat, Jimmy Skunk, Little Joe Otter, old Grandfather Frog, and even old Mr. Toad were there. Last of all came Spotty the Turtle. Now, Spotty the Turtle is a very slow walker, and he cannot run at all. When Peter Rabbit saw him coming up toward the old butternut tree, he shouted, "Come, Spotty, don't you want to race with us?" Everybody laughed, because, Spotty is very, very slow. But Spotty didn't laugh, and he didn't get cross, because everyone else laughed. "There is an old wise saying, Peter Rabbit," said Spotty the Turtle, "which shows that those who run fastest do not always reach a first place. I think I will enter this race." And here's a little picture. That is Spotty the Turtle and old Grandfather Frog. Everyone thought that Spotty the Turtle entering the race was the best joke they had heard for a long time, and they laughed harder than ever. They all agreed that Spotty the Turtle should start in the race too. So they all stood in a row, Peter Rabbit first, then Billy Mink, then Reddy Fox, and right beside Reddy Fox, Spotty the Turtle. "Are you ready?" said Grandfather Frog. "Set. Go." Away went Peter Rabbit with a great big jump. After him went Billy Mink so fast that he was just a little brown streak going through the tall grass, and side by side with him ran Reddy Fox. Now just as they started, Spotty the Turtle reached up and grabbed the long hair on the end of Reddy's big tail. Of course, Reddy couldn't have stopped to shake him off because Peter Rabbit and Billy Mink were running so fast that he had to run his very best to keep up with them. But he didn't even know that Spotty Turtle was there. You see, Spotty is not very heavy, and Reddy Fox was so excited that he did not notice that his big tail was heavier than usual. The Merry Little Breezes flew along too to see that the race was fair. Peter Rabbit went with great big jumps. Whenever he came to a little bush, he jumped right over it, for Peter Rabbit's legs are long and meant for jumping. Billy Mink is so slim that he slipped between the bushes and through the long grass like a little brown streak. Reddy Fox, who is bigger than either Peter Rabbit or Billy Mink, had no trouble in keeping up with them. Not one of them noticed that Spotty the Turtle was hanging fast to the end of Reddy's tail. Now, just at the foot of the little hill on which the big hickory tree grew was a little pond. It wasn't very wide, but it was quite long. Billy Mink remembered this pond, and he chuckled to himself as he raced along, for he knew that Peter Rabbit couldn't swim, and he knew that Reddy Fox does not like the water, so therefore both would have to run around the pond. He himself can swim even faster than he can run. The more he thought of this, the more foolish it seemed that he should carry on such a warm day. For, said Billy Mink to himself, even if they reach the pond first, they will have to run around it, while I can swim across it and cool off while I am swimming. I will surely get there first. So Billy Mink ran slower and slower, and pretty soon he had dropped behind. Mr. Sun, round and red, looking down, smiled and smiled to see the race. The more he smiled, the warmer it grew. Now, Peter Rabbit had a thick gray coat, and Reddy Fox had a thick red coat, and they both began to get very, very warm. And here you can see Peter Rabbit and Reddy the Fox getting very, very warm. Peter Rabbit did not make such long jumps as when he first started. Reddy Fox began to feel very thirsty, and his tongue hung out. Now that Billy Mink was behind them, they thought they did not need to hurry so. Peter Rabbit reached the little pond first. He had not thought of that pond when he agreed to enter the race. He stopped right on the edge of it and sat up on his hind legs. Right across, he could see the big hickory tree, so near, and yet so far. For he knew that he must run around the pond and then back again, and it was a long, long way. In just a moment, Reddy Fox ran out of the bushes, and Reddy felt very much as Peter Rabbit did. Way, way behind them was Billy Mink, trotting along comfortably and chuckling to himself. Peter Rabbit looked at Reddy Fox in dismay, and Reddy Fox looked at Peter Rabbit in dismay. Then they both looked at Billy Mink and remembered that Billy Mink could swim right across. Then off Peter Rabbit started as fast as he could go around the pond one way, and Reddy Fox started around the pond the other way. They were so excited that neither noticed a little splash in the pond. That was Spotty the Turtle, who had let go of Reddy's tail and now was swimming across the pond. For you know that Spotty is a splendid swimmer. Only once or twice he stuck his little black nose up to get some air. The rest of the time he swam under water, and no one but the Merry Little Breezes saw him. Right across he swam and climbed up the bank right under the big old hickory tree. Now, there were just 3 nuts left under the hickory tree. 2 of these Spotty took down to the edge of the pond and buried in the mud. The other he took in his mouth, and then started back across the pond. Just as he reached the other shore, up trotted Billy Mink. But Billy Mink didn't see Spotty. He was too intent watching Reddy Fox and Peter Rabbit, who were now halfway around the pond. In he jumped with a splash. My, how good that cool water felt! He didn't have to hurry now because he felt sure the race was his. So he swam round and chased some fish and had a beautiful time in the water. By and by he looked up and saw that Peter Rabbit was almost around the pond one way, and Reddy Fox was almost round the pond the other way. They both looked tired and hot and discouraged. Then Billy Mink swam slowly across and climbed out on the bank under the big hickory tree. But where were the nuts? Look as he would, he could not see a nut anywhere. Yet the Merry Little Breezes had said there were 3 nuts lying under the hickory tree. Billy Mink ran this way and ran that way. He was still running around, poking over the leaves and looking under the twigs and pieces of bark, when Peter Rabbit and Reddy Fox showed up. They, too, began to look under the leaves and under the bark. They pawed around in the grass. They hunted in every nook and cranny, but not a nut could they find. They were tired and cross and hot, and they accused Billy Mink of having hidden the nuts. Billy Mink stoutly insisted that he had not hidden the nuts, that he had not found the nuts, and when they saw how hard he was hunting, they believed him. All the afternoon they hunted and hunted and hunted, and all the afternoon Spotty the Turtle, with one nut in his mouth, was slowly, oh so slowly, crawling straight back across the Green Meadows toward the old butternut tree. Round red Mr. Sun was getting very close to the Purple Hills where he goes to bed every night, and all the little meadow folk were getting ready to go to their homes. They were wondering and wondering what could have happened to the races when Sammy Jay spied the Merry Little Breezes dancing across the Green Meadows. "Here come the Merry Little Breezes! They'll tell us who wins the race!" cried Sammy Jay. When the Merry Little Breezes reached the old butternut tree, all the little meadow folk crowded round them, but the Merry Little Breezes just laughed and wouldn't say a word. Then, all of a sudden, out of the tall meadow grass crept Spotty the Turtle and laid the hickory nut at the feet of Old Grandfather Frog. Old Grandfather Frog was so surprised that he actually let a great green fly buzz right past his nose. "Where did you get that hickory nut?" asked Grandfather Frog. "Under the big hickory tree on the hill on the other side of the Green Meadows," said Spotty. Then all the Merry Little Breezes clapped their hands and shouted, "He did! He did! Spotty wins the race!" Then they told how Spotty reached the pond by clinging to the tip of Reddy Fox's tail and had hidden the other 2 nuts, and then how he had patiently crawled home while Billy Mink and Reddy Fox and Peter Rabbit were hunting and hunting and hunting for the nuts they could not find. And so Spotty the Turtle was awarded the race, and to this day Peter Rabbit and Reddy Fox and Billy Mink can't bear the sight of hickory nuts. And that's how Spotty the Turtle won the race. This is a good book, The Old Mother West Wind Stories. They're by Thornton Burgess. And a big thank you again to Miss Cody for bringing them to me and giving them to me. It's great to actually have a book in hand. Now, the only book I don't have in hand right now is Alice in Wonderland, but I do have the papers. So we're at the final 2 chapters of Alice in Wonderland. It's a 12-chapter book, and we started early, well, exactly a week ago. And now we will finish with these last 2 chapters. Again, feel free to leave me some suggestions on books you'd like to have read. I have a whole stack here of things I might try, but I'd love to hear what you'd like to have read as well. Just double checking. Making sure everything is okay. Okay. Chapter 11 of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. Chapter 11, Who Stole the Tarts? The King and Queen of Hearts were seated on their throne when they arrived, with a great crowd assembled round them, all sorts of little birds and beasts, as well as the whole pack of cards. The knave was standing before them, in chains, with a soldier on each side to guard him. And near the king was the white little rabbit, with a trumpet in one hand and a scroll of parchment in the other. In the very middle of the court was a table with a large dish of tarts upon it. They looked so good that it made Alice quite hungry to look at them. I wish they'd get the trial done, she thought, and hand round the refreshments. But there seemed to be no chance of this, so she began thinking at everything about her, and to pass the time. Alice had never been in a court of justice before, but she had read about them in books, and she was quite pleased to find that she knew the name of nearly everything there. That's the judge, she said to herself, because of his great wig. The judge, by the way, was the king, and as he wore his crown over the wig, he did not look at all comfortable, and it was certainly not becoming. And that's the jury box, thought Alice, and those 12 creatures? She was obliged to say creatures, you see, because some of them were animals and some were birds. I suppose those creatures are the jurors. She said this last word 2 or 3 times over to herself, being rather proud of it, for she thought, and rightly too, that very few girls of her age knew the meaning of it at all. However, jury people would have done just as well. The 12 jurors were all writing very busily on slates. "What are they doing?" Alice whispered to the Gryphon. "They can't have anything to put down yet before the trial's begun." "They're putting down their names," the Gryphon whispered in reply, "for fear they should forget them before the end of the trial." "Stupid things!" Alice began in a loud, indignant voice. But she stopped hastily, for the white rabbit cried, "Silence in the court!" And the king put on his spectacles and looked anxiously around to make out who was talking. Alice could see, as well as if she were looking over their shoulders, that all the jurors were writing down "stupid things" on their slates, and she could even make out that one of them didn't know how to spell stupid, and that he had to ask his neighbor to tell him. A nice muddle their slates'll be before this trial's over, thought Alice. One of the jurors had a pencil that squeaked. This, of course, Alice could not stand, and she went round the court and got behind him, and very soon found an opportunity to take it away. She did it so quickly that the poor little juror, it was Bill the lizard, could not make out at all what had become of it. So, after hunting all about for it, he was obliged to write with one finger for the rest of the day, and this was of very little use, as it left no mark on the slate. "Harold, read the execution," said the king. On this the white rabbit blew 3 blasts on the trumpet, and then unrolled the parchment scroll and read as follows. "The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts, all on a summer day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole those tarts, and took them quite away." "Consider your verdict," the king said to the jury. Not yet, not yet, the rabbit hastily interrupted. There's a great deal to come before that. Call the witnesses, said the king, and the rabbit blew 3 blasts on the trumpet and called out, First witness! The first witness was the Hatter. He came in with a teacup in one hand and a piece of bread and butter in the other. I beg pardon, your majesty, he began, for bringing these in, but I hadn't quite finished my tea when I was sent for. You ought to have finished, said the king. When did you begin? The Hatter looked at the March Hare who had followed him into the court, arm in arm with the Dormouse. The 14th of March, I think it was, he said. 15th, said the March Hare. 16th, added the Dormouse. Write that down, the king said to the jury, and the jury eagerly wrote down all 3 dates on their slates and then added them up and reduced the answer to shillings and pence. Take off your hat, the king said to the Hatter. Oh, it's not mine, said the Hatter. Stolen? The king exclaimed, turning to the jury, who instantly made a memorandum of the fact. I keep them to sell, the Hatter added as an explanation. I've none of my own. I'm a Hatter. Here the queen put on her spectacles and began staring at the Hatter, who turned pale and fidgeted. Give your evidence, said the king, and don't be nervous, or I'll have you executed on the spot. This did not seem to encourage the witness at all. He kept shifting from one foot to the other, looking uneasily at the queen, and in his confusion he bit a large piece out of his teacup instead of the bread and butter. Just at this moment Alice felt a very curious sensation, which puzzled her a good deal until she made out what it was. She was beginning to grow larger again, and she thought at first she would get up and leave the court. But on second thought she decided to remain where she was as long as there was room for her. I wish you wouldn't squeeze so, said the Dormouse who was sitting next to her. I can't hardly breathe. I can't help it, said Alice very meekly. I'm growing. You have no right to grow here, said the Dormouse. Oh, don't talk nonsense, said Alice very boldly. You know you're growing too. Yes, but I grow at a reasonable pace, said the Dormouse, not in that ridiculous fashion. And he got up very sulkily and crossed over to the other side of the court. All this time the queen had never left off staring at the Hatter, and just as the Dormouse crossed the court, she had said to one of the officers of the court, Bring me the list of singers in the last concert, on which the wretched Hatter trembled so that he shook both his shoes off. Give your evidence, the king repeated angrily, or I'll have you executed, whether you're nervous or not. I'm a poor man, your majesty, the Hatter began in a trembling voice, and I hadn't begun my tea, not above a week or so, and what with bread and butter getting so thin and the twinkling of the tea. The twinkling of the what? Said the king. It began with the tea, the Hatter replied. Of course twinkling begins with a tea, said the king sharply. Do you make me for a dunce? Go on. I'm a poor man, the Hatter went on, and most things twinkled after that, only the March Hare said— I didn't, the March Hare interrupted in a great hurry. You did, said the Hatter. I deny it, said the March Hare. He denies it, said the King. Leave that part out. Well, at any rate, the Dormouse said, the Hatter went on, looking anxiously round to see if he would deny it too, but the Dormouse denied nothing, being once again fast asleep. After that, continued the Hatter, I cut some more bread and butter. What did the Dormouse say? One of the jury asked. I can't remember, said the Hatter. You must remember, remarked the King, or I'll have you executed. The miserable Hatter dropped his teacup and bread and butter and went down on one knee. I'm a poor man, your Majesty, he began. You're a very poor speaker, said the King. Here, one of the guinea pigs cheered and was immediately suppressed by the officers of the court. As that is rather a large word, I will first just explain to you how it is done. They had a large canvas bag which was tied up at the mouth with strings. Into this they slipped the guinea pig head first and closed it. I'm glad I've seen that done, thought Alice. I've so often read in the newspapers at the end of trials there were some attempts at applause which was immediately suppressed by the officers of the court, and I never understood what it meant till now. If that's all you know about it, you may stand down, continued the King. I can't go no lower, said the Hatter. I'm on the floor as it is. Then you may sit down, the King replied. And the other guinea pig cheered and was also suppressed. Come, that finished the guinea pigs, thought Alice. Now we shall get on better. I'd rather finish my tea, said the Hatter with an anxious look at the Queen, who was reading the list of singers. You may go, said the King, and the Hatter hurriedly left the court without even waiting to put on his shoes. Just take his head off outside, the Queen added to one of the officers. But the Hatter was out of sight before the officer could get to the door. Call the next witness, said the King. The next witness was the Duchess's cook. She carried the pepper box in her hand, and Alice guessed who it was, even before she got into court, by the way the people near the door began sneezing all at once. Give your evidence, said the King. Shan't, said the cook. The King looked anxiously at the White Rabbit, who said in a low voice, Your Majesty must cross-examine this witness. Well, if I must, I must, the King said, with a melancholy air, and after folding his arms and frowning at the cook till his eyes were nearly out of sight, he said in a very deep voice, What are tarts made of? Pepper, mostly, said the cook. Treacle, said a sleepy voice behind her. Collar that dormouse, the Queen shrieked. Behead the dormouse. Turn that dormouse out of court. Suppress him, pinch him, off with his whiskers. For some minutes the whole court was in confusion, getting the dormouse turned out, and by the time they had settled down again, the cook had disappeared. Never mind, said the King with an air of great relief. Call the next witness. And he added in an undertone to the Queen, Really, my dear, you must cross-examine the next witness. It quite makes my forehead ache. Alice watched the White Rabbit as he fumbled over the list, feeling very curious to see what the next witness would be like. For they haven't got much evidence yet, she said to herself. Imagine her surprise when the White Rabbit read out at the top of his shrill little voice the name Alice! Chapter 12. Alice's Evidence. "Here!" cried Alice, quite forgetting in the flurry of the moment how large she had grown in the last few minutes, and she jumped up in such a hurry that she tipped over the jury box with the edge of her skirt, upsetting all the jurors on their heads of the crowd below, and there they lay sprawling about, reminding her very much of a globe of goldfish she had accidentally upset the week before. "Oh, I beg your pardon," she exclaimed in a tone of great dismay, and began picking them up again as quickly as she could, for the accident of the goldfish kept running in her head, and she had a vague sort of idea that they must be collected at once and put back into the jury box, or they would die. "The trial cannot proceed," said the king in a very grave voice, "until all the jurors are back in their proper places. All," he repeated with great emphasis, looking hard at Alice as he said so. Alice looked at the jury box and saw that in her haste she had put the lizard in head downwards, and the poor little thing was waving its tail about in a melancholy way, quite unable to move. She soon got it out again and put it right. "Not that it signifies much," she said to herself. "I should think it would be quite as much use in the trial one way up as the other." As soon as the jury had recovered from the shock of being upset, and their slates and pencils had been found and handed back to them, they set to work very diligently to write out a history of the incident, all except the lizard, who seemed too much overcome to do anything but sit with its mouth open, gazing up into the roof of the court. "What do you know about all this business?" the king said to Alice. "Nothing," said Alice. "Nothing whatsoever?" persisted the king. "Nothing whatsoever," said Alice. "That's very important," the king said, turning to the jury. They were just beginning to write this down on their slates when the White Rabbit interrupted. "Unimportant, your majesty means, of course," he said in a very respectful tone, but frowning and making faces at him as he spoke. "Unimportant, of course, I meant," the king hastily said, and went on to himself in an undertone. "Important, unimportant, unimportant, important," as if he were trying which word sounded best. Some of the jury wrote down important, and some unimportant. Alice could see this as she was near enough to look over their slates. But it doesn't matter a bit, she thought to herself. At this moment the king, who had been for some time busily writing in his notebook, cackled out, "Silence!" and read out from his book, "Rule 42. All persons more than a mile high to leave the court." Everybody looked at Alice. "I'm not a mile high," said Alice. "You are," said the king. "Nearly 2 miles high," added the queen. "Well, I shan't go, at any rate," said Alice. "Besides, that's not a regular rule. You invented it just now." "It's the oldest rule in the book," said the king. "Then it ought to be rule number 1, said Alice. The king turned pale and shut his book hastily. "Consider your verdict," he said to the jury in a low, trembling voice. "There's more evidence to come yet, please, your majesty," said the White Rabbit, jumping up in a great hurry. "This paper has just been picked up." "What is it?" said the queen. "I haven't opened it yet," said the White Rabbit, "but it seems to be a letter, written by the prisoner to somebody.
It must have been that, said the king, unless it was written to nobody, which isn't usual, you know.
Who is it directed to? Said one of the jurors. It isn't directed at all, said the White Rabbit. In fact, there's nothing written on the outside. He unfolded the paper as he spoke and added, It isn't a letter after all. It's a set of verses.
Are they in the prisoner's handwriting? Asked another juror.
No, they're not, said the White Rabbit. And that's the queerest thing about it.
The jury all looked puzzled. You must have imitated somebody else's hand, said the king.
The jury all brightened up again. Please, your majesty, said the knave, I didn't write it, and I can't prove it. There's no name signed at the end.
If you didn't sign it, said the king, that only makes the matter worse. You must have meant some mischief, or else you'd have signed your name like the honest man.
There was general clapping of hands at this. It was the first really clever thing the king had said all day. That proves his guilt, said the queen. It proves nothing of the sort, said Alice. Why, you don't even know what they're about.
Read them, said the king.
The White Rabbit put on his spectacles. Where shall I begin, please, your majesty? He asked.
Begin at the beginning, said the king gravely, and go on till you have come to the end, then stop.
These were the verses the White Rabbit read. They told me you had seen her, and mentioned me to him. She gave me a good character, but said I could not swim. She sent them word I had not gone. We know it to be true. If she should push the matter on, what would become of you? I gave her one, they gave him two. You gave us three or more, they all returned from him to you, though they were mine before. If I or she should chance to be involved in this affair, he trusts to you to set them free, exactly as they were. My notion was that you had been, before she had this fit, an obstacle that came between him and ourselves and it. Don't let him know she liked them best, for this must ever be a secret kept from all the rest between yourself and me.
That's the most important piece of evidence we've heard yet, said the king, rubbing his hands. Now let the jury...
If any one of them can explain it, said Alice. She had grown so large in the last few minutes that she wasn't a bit afraid of interrupting him. I'll give him sixpence. I don't believe there's an atom of meaning in it. The jury all wrote down on their slates, she doesn't believe there's an atom of meaning in it. But none of them attempted to explain the paper.
If there's no meaning in it, said the king, that saves a world of trouble, you know, as we needn't try to find any. And yet, I don't know, he went on, spreading out the verse on his knee and looking at them with one eye. I seem to see some meaning in them, after all. She said I could not swim. You can't swim, can you? He added, turning to the knave. The knave shook his head sadly. Do I look like it? He said, which he certainly did not, being entirely made of cardboard. All right, so far, said the king, and he went on muttering about the verses to himself. We know it to be true. That's the jury, of course. I gave her one, then gave him two. Why, that must be what he did with the tarts, you know.
But it goes on. They all returned from him to you, said Alice.
Why, there they are, said the king triumphantly, pointing to the tarts on the table. Nothing can be clearer than that. Then again, before she had this fit. You never had fits, my dear, I think, he said to the queen.
Never, said the queen furiously, throwing an inkstand at the lizard as she spoke. The unfortunate little Bill the lizard had left off writing on his slate with one finger, as he found it made no mark, but he now hastily began again, using the ink that was running down his face as long as it lasted.
Then the words don't fit you, said the king, looking round the court with a smile.
There was a dead silence.
It's a pun,
said the king in an offended tone, and everybody laughed.
Let the jury consider their verdict,
the king said, for about the 20th time that day.
No, no, said the queen. Sentence first, verdict afterwards.
Stuff and nonsense, said Alice loudly. The idea of having the sentence first.
Hold your tongue,
said the queen, turning purple.
I won't, said Alice.
Off with her head, the queen shouted at the top of her voice. Nobody moved. Who cares for you, said Alice. She had grown to her full size by this time. You are nothing but a pack of cards. At this the whole pack rose up into the air and came flying down upon her. She gave a little scream, half of fright and half of anger, and tried to beat them off, and found herself lying on the bank, with her head in the lap of her sister, who was gently brushing away some dead leaves that had fluttered down from the trees upon her face. "Wake up, dear Alice," said her sister. "Why, what a long sleep you've had." "Oh, I've had such a curious dream," said Alice, and she told her sister, as well as she could remember them, all these strange adventures of hers that you have just been reading about. And when she had finished, her sister kissed her, and said, "It was a curious dream, dear, certainly. But now run into your tea. It's getting late." So Alice got up and ran off, thinking while she ran, as well as she might, what a wonderful dream it had been. But her sister sat still, just as she left her, leaning her hand on her head and watching the setting sun, and thinking of little Alice and all her wonderful adventures, till she too began dreaming after a fashion, and this was her dream. First, she dreamed of little Alice herself, and once again the tiny hands were clasped upon her knee, and the bright, eager eyes were looking up into hers. She could hear the very tones of her voice, and see that queer little toss of her head to keep back the wandering hair that would always get into her eyes. And still, as she listened, or seemed to listen, the whole place around her became alive with the strange creatures of her little sister's dream. The long grass rustled at her feet as the white rabbit hurried by. The frightened mouse splashed his way through the neighboring pool. She could hear the rattle of the teacups as the March Hare and his friends shared their never-ending meal, and the shrill voice of the queen ordering off her unfortunate guests to execution. Once more the pig baby was sneezing on the Duchess's knee, while plates and dishes crashed around. Once more the shriek of the gryphon, the squeaking of the lizard's slate pencil, and the choking of the suppressed guinea pigs filled the air, mixed up with the distant sobs of the miserable mock turtle. So she sat on, with eyes closed, and half believed herself in Wonderland, though she knew she would not be when she opened them again, and all would change to dull reality. The grass would only be rustling in the wind, and the pool rippling to the waving of the reeds. The rattling teacups would change to tinkling sheep bells, and the queen's shrill cries to the voice of the shepherd boy. And the sneeze of the baby, the shriek of the gryphon, and all the other queer noises would change, she knew, to the confused clamor of the busy farmyard, while the lowing of the cattle in the distance would take the place of the mock turtle's heavy sobs. Lastly, she pictured to herself how this same little sister of hers would, in the after-time, be herself a grown woman, and how she would keep through all her riper years the simple and loving heart of her childhood, and how she would gather about her other little children and make their eyes bright and eager with many a strange tale, perhaps even with the dream of Wonderland of long ago, and how she would feel with all their simple sorrows and find a pleasure in all their simple joys, remembering her own child life and the happy days of summer. And that is the end of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And that is the end of the first round of book reading for the Aurora Bedtime Story Project. Thank you so much for watching and for sharing and for liking and leaving comments and yeah, it's been a real pleasure to be able to do this. And excuse me. All that tea that Alice had. It's been a pleasure to do this, and I'm looking forward to starting on in the next book. We'll see what that will be tomorrow. And we'll be here in the right same place, 8:30 live. And with that, have a good night. Sleep well with all this lovely rain. We need it. From my little reading nook to yours. Bye-bye.